I'd like to share with you a beautiful and touching story about a pope and a little boy. Mother Frances Alice Monica Forbes, a biographer and a contemporary of Giuseppe Sarto, who was Pope Pius X, tells the story of an English woman who had the privilege of having a private audience with the Pope around the turn of the century, of the 19th century into the 20th century. This is the early 1900s. Now, Pius X at this point in time had already earned for himself of being a great lover of children. He had that reputation. And so the woman brought her 4-year-old son with her to this meeting to receive a special blessing. And as the Pope and the mother were speaking, the little boy, who was standing off at a distance looking on, when the conversation was finished, the boy was brought over to the Pope and was given his blessing. Now, much to the horror of the mother, though, the little boy went right to the Pope, placed his hands right on his knees, and looked up at him. And allaying the fears of his embarrassed mother, the Pope smiled at the boy, patted his head, and said, "How old is he?" His mother said, "He's just 4. And in 2 or 3 years, I hope he'd be able to make his first communion." See, just a short time earlier, the Pope had issued a decree lowering the age at which children could receive Holy Communion. It used to be in their teenage years, but he brought it down to the age of 7. This was very significant. He didn't want children to be deprived of the great gift of Jesus in the Eucharist. And so this little boy was looking forward to making his first communion in just a couple of years. And when the mother said this, the little boy expressed his own excitement about the prospect of receiving Holy Communion. And this sparked the interest of the Pope. And he looked into the boy's eyes and he asked, "Whom do you receive in Holy Communion?" And the little boy, without hesitating, answered, "Jesus Christ." The Pope smiled and then asked, "And who is Jesus Christ?" And once more, the little boy, without meeting a beat, said, "He is God." The Pope leaned back in his chair and he looked over at the boy's mother and he said, "Bring him back here tomorrow. I will give him his first communion myself." 4 years old. That is a true story. Now, this little boy, whose name has faded into the shadows of time, I think that he has a lot to teach us. With the innocence and purity of a 4-year-old, his understanding of the doctrine of the Holy Eucharist really surpasses that of any scholar or any theologian, and his love for it rivals that of any saint. With eyes that have not been tainted by skepticism and doubt, and with a heart that has not known the darkness of sin, he looks upon the Eucharist with such simplicity and love. And he literally throws himself on the lap of the Pope, the vicar of Christ on earth, and articulates so plainly and beautifully what so many of us struggle to believe. For this little boy, there's no question. Jesus is really and truly and simply present in the Eucharist. And his little heart cannot help but desire so great a gift. And then the very next day, at the hands of the Pope, who would himself become a saint, his desires are realized. His Lord and his God comes to him in Holy Communion. And in an instant, the great miracle of God's love is accomplished in yet another soul. Maybe this is what Jesus is getting at when he tells us in Matthew's Gospel that unless you turn and become like little children, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven. My friends, so much of our life is centered on growing up. I've been thinking about this as I get older. I have a birthday later this month. Birthdays are not as exciting as they used to be. But how much of our time and energy is spent into this process of growing up, of being the mature adults that we know that we need to be? We value maturity and wisdom and experience over and above many other things in this life. And while we should never negate the importance of these things, I do think we need to keep in mind that our ways are not God's ways. The mysteries of our faith, while they have baffled the learned and confounded the most diligent of theologians over time, they are so often grasped effortlessly by little children. And in their innocence and their purity, children never try to be something that they're not. Unlike those of us who try to mine through our way in this dog-eat-dog world where we're constantly competing with each other and trying to get other people to think important, lofty things about us, children don't do that, at least not when they're young like this. They know their own helplessness, and they instinctively cry out to their parents for every need that they have. And when we introduce them so young to Jesus, they easily abandon themselves to him. Life and experience and growing up bring many good things for us. But sometimes, oftentimes, we will learn to trust more in the obvious ourselves and less in God. This is why I think we have so much to learn from the children. In our gospel today, Jesus is inviting this vast crowd to leave the world of the obvious and to enter into the world of children, the world of faith. Last week, we heard of the great miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and fish, where Jesus filled the hungry bellies of the multitude with an abundance of earthly food. And we are told that this was a great sign, a foreshadowing of the greater miracle of the Eucharist, where Jesus would fill their hungry souls with a superabundance of heavenly food, his own body and blood, his own self. But today the crowds are just not getting it. They're like hungry animals. They're chasing after Jesus in the hopes that that he will give them another meal, that he will give them more bread. They're so fixated on the obvious, on the temporal, on the earthly, and they are content to just use Jesus to meet those needs. But as they focus on their bellies, they've neglected to see that the bread that they are actually hungering for is none other than the bread of life. Jesus himself standing right in front of them. To see this, though, requires simplicity and abandonment. It requires a heart that can see beyond appearances and superficialities. In other words, it requires the heart of a child. The Holy Eucharist is, as the Second Vatican Council tells us, the source and summit of the Christian life. Because it is the sacrament that makes present to us Jesus Christ himself, it is the source of all grace. The greatest part of your week is right now, right here. And even though it's warm and uncomfortable and we would probably want to be anywhere else, this is the summit of our week. This is where it all points to and where all goodness flows from. This is where the heart of God beats for love of us in all of the tabernacles of the world, calling us to adore and to feast upon him who can satisfy our deepest hungers. And yet it is so easy to take this wonderful and holy reality for granted. And I'm right there with you. It's hard for me too. We can become so distracted by all of our earthly concerns, just entrenched in the world of the obvious, the world of adult problems, that we completely miss that the answer to all of our hungers and desires rests wherever that little red lamp glows. We can be like the crowd that harps on Jesus to give them more of the things of this world, or we can be like the little boy who knows very simply and beautifully that Jesus is going to fill him beyond all measure in the Holy Eucharist. He doesn't know how, he just knows. So today during this Mass, as we prepare to receive him again, maybe we could pray for the grace to put aside all of our grown-up problems, all of our grown-up issues, and ask for the grace to grow down, becoming more and more like little children. And as we come forward to receive Holy Communion today, I don't want you to actually do this, but run up with childlike faith and allow Jesus to fill you with himself. Savor his sweetness, feast upon his goodness, and may we learn to leave the world of the obvious more and more and enter into the world of mystery, the world of faith, the world of the Eucharist. And when we learn to do this, Jesus tells us, like little children, we too will not be far from the kingdom of heaven.